so much respect for the work that you do at NAMI Urban LA, and the honor of being able to honor Bebe Moore Campbell with this event. I've had the pleasure of participating in the past in person, and was just commenting to Adrienne and Harold just how much of a wonderful party you throw in person. I certainly miss that connection, and hope that one day we're able to return to that. But I wanted to take this opportunity as we were talking about the theme, and thank you to Dr. Williams for her presentation. There's a lot of resonance here. My theme is very similar, and that is from a cultural perspective, to consider, why it is that we people of color are disproportionately impacted by issues such as mental health or mental illness, and to also consider how our identities and our experiences impact systems as well. So again, thank you so much for the opportunity, and we'll go to the first slide. And so, as we talk about mental wellness and mental health, it's again, I think Dr. Williams touched on this, but it is important to recognize that mental wellness is not just simply an absence of mental illness. When we want to work towards wellness, it's a level of balance that includes our emotional, psychological, social, and I would add spiritual health. And how we navigate that is also so much rooted in our own identities and how we navigate our identities, how our identities have been shaped by these factors, by our environment and by our well-being. So it is important for us to recognize that we can't really realize our potential if we don't have that experience of balance. And having that experience of balance really comes from being able to feel supported in our communities, and being that we have a purpose and we have a sense of anchoring that connects us to our ancestors, that connects us to our identity and connects us to our communities. Next slide, please. So why mental health matters uniquely and particularly to minorities and people of color. I think it's so important for us to really think about our experiences, our diaspora, and our migration stories. All of us are immigrants to this country, whether forced or by choice. But it is important to think about how that has impacted our development. Even if we're not first generation, there is that collective consciousness that really plays into who we are. So it's important for us to recognize that we do have a disproportionate burden and impact of multi-generational trauma. And we've recognized now, we're recognizing more and more how this trauma really gets embedded in our very DNA, and how this trauma gets passed on from generation to generation, particularly if we're not analytical, if we're not observing how these traumas really influence our family development and our stories that get passed on from one generation to the next. This idea of modern disconnection and isolation, is important to recognize that it's not natural to our communities of color. This disconnection really is a byproduct of the chronic and long-standing oppression that has had an impact of marginalizing our communities, and the lack of access to culturally competent and culturally congruent services means that even when help is provided, we don't always see ourselves identified in the provision of care. We don't always relate to the way in which we are given services, because so many times the services that are designed, they're not designed really by our people for our people. And so there's always a little bit of a disconnect and a mistrust that really comes from this sort of long-standing isolation and marginalization of our people and our stories that get passed on. And so as we think about this disproportionate impact, it's also important to recognize that minorities and people of color are going to be, the impact is going to be that we are overrepresented in terms of learning disabilities, in terms of mental illness, in terms of institutions such as jails, and that we are going to be labeled as having learning difficulties, as not really kind of falling in line. And when we talk about who is it that's making that observation, again, oftentimes it's not people that understand who we are. And so that is one of the reasons why the more different that the professional, the clinician, the provider is from the population being served, the more likely there is to be this tendency to project stereotypes, if particularly the person is not really aware of their biases and their tendency to project onto people of color. There's also this constant thing that we struggle with as people of color, this idea of assimilation and acculturation. When I grew up in suburbs of Chicago, my family was so adamant that we learn English as quickly as possible, that we don't have friendships, because the idea of having friends would mean that we would invite attention to our home and that people would see that we are different. And so I was, as a kid, forbidden to have many friends because my family, my parents, didn't want us to really kind of stick out and be identified. And so that the other sort of metaphor example that I have in mind is the idea of America, the melting pot, which as children, it was sold to us, right? That if you just sort of play along and you follow the rules and you're a good person and you behave and do all that you're supposed to do, there is going to be a prize for you at the end. Once you get your degree and once you really kind of demonstrate that you're a good citizen, you're going to be accepted as part of the majority, and you're going to be incorporated in this experience of America as a melting pot. And so we've taught children to really assimilate, to be a part of the majority culture, to fit in, to straighten their hair, to change the color of their eyes, to really look as the model of an idea of beauty and power, so that they don't get marginalized. And we now recognize through research and through experience what damage that does to children when they recognize that no matter how hard you try and no matter how deeply committed you are to fitting in, that there's just going to be this experience of you as being othered, of being different. And so it is important for us to think about how we can shift that model of assimilation to acculturation, where we really do identify and recognize that culture, in Spanish there is the saying cultura cura, that culture cures, that the idea of us connecting to our culture, our ancestral traditions, our communities is not only a way of connecting and creating a social fiber, but it is also and reinforcing the experience of uniqueness, the experience of power that really comes from our ancestors and it comes from our identity. We can't change the color of our skin. We can't change our historical and cultural background. And so it is important for us to understand that we must celebrate that, because that is where the power really comes in, that it really is about teaching children to look deeply within themselves and celebrate the unique talent and contributions of their ancestors and their own identity. And this idea of acculturation then versus assimilation, I think, is an important implication for us, because those of us that have really tried to assimilate, then we become divisive, we become disconnected, and we become the oppressor. We internalize the oppressor and then oppress our own people by the very tools that we've learned. And I think that our education, if we don't really pay attention to it, can become one of the fountains of assimilation that really, once we get our degrees and once we go out and work in community, if we're not really paying attention, that it could very easily be oftentimes the very pathway to oppress and the very pathway to separate and divide. Next slide. And so the importance of connection from a cultural lens is important to identify. Connection, particularly during difficult times, is the best way to protect against mental illness, because isolation, we know, and particularly in the work of addiction, that so much of addiction now, as the genius Gabor Mate tells us, that addiction is really an expression of trauma that really comes from isolation and disconnection. And so it's very important for us to recognize that connecting fiber, that ability to connect, is a protective factor against mental illness. And connecting to community and unity is so critical, because it allows us the opportunity to really celebrate our traditions, our food, our dance, our spirituality. And through that celebration, we strengthen a sense of who we are. We strengthen our identity. We build resilience. We create a sense of safety and belonging, and we communicate that to our children particularly. So all of that level of connection really reduces stress. And as Dr. Williams was saying, we're not intended to be islands. We're not intended to be disconnected. And so as we recognize that our communities right now are starving for connection, it becomes important for us to recognize that connection is not just about building community again. It is about creating mental wellness and fortifying identity, so that the idea of being a person of color or a minority is not something to be ashamed of, but is something to be celebrated. And as we get that connection, then it does improve not only our mental health, but we also know through research that it also has an impact of management of chronic illnesses such as diabetes, hypertension, obesity, and so many other problems that are really related to our internalization of oppression without the words to really express and to really alleviate so much of the pain that we carry. And so communities of color come from ancestral traditions that used to value family, community, collective wellness, and collective wellness in comparison to the oftentimes American ideal of have it your way, individuality. You got to beat the competition. You got to be all that you can be, and be competitive, be the number one. And everybody else that is struggling or that is fighting to get to the top of that ladder and to get to the very top of that corporation, that person is the hero. But in reality, you're also chewing so many people up on the way that you don't recognize that that's not who you're intended to be. That's not where your people come from. It really is about supporting each other. It's about in Nahuatl tradition, in our Mexican native tradition, the idea is that we all have tonali, we all have a unique energy, and that unique energy is only fully expressed when we recognize that it has to be felt within the community. You have a purpose, but the purpose is really intended to be within the collective. When we were kids, it's like, well, you know, that's so-and-so's son. And if you're walking down the street and your auntie and the neighbor and everybody would tell on you, because why? Because you're connected. You're part of one community, and your value doesn't come from you as an individual and how many degrees you have and how much you've been able to accumulate in life. Your value comes from what you're able to do for your family, for your community, for your tribe. And we oftentimes, in this culture of assimilation, in this culture of competition and beating out all of the potential enemies, we become isolated, we become disempowered, and we become disconnected from our power base. Next slide, please. Can we go to the next slide? Oh, sorry. So then, I'm sorry, to the previous one, I didn't. So the connection then and isolation, it's important for us to think about what has been the impact, the systemic impact of disconnection and isolation in our communities. So it's important for us to recognize that traditional systems, whether those are economic, educational, our correctional systems, our health systems, all of these systems, that these traditional systems have been significantly impacted by colonization and other forms of systemic oppression, particularly affecting people of color and minorities. These systems were not designed to help our people progress and advance. These systems were not designed to really make our people become leaders and access power and access wealth. They've been oftentimes developed for the opposite purpose, which is to really oppress and marginalize. And all we need to look is like housing, getting a loan, figuring out what school you're going to go to, figuring out what neighborhood you're going to be living in. All of that stuff we know, really is informed by traditional systems. And so the impact of oppression results in a disruption of traditional structures. The policies and practices of traditional systems often are disrupting and undermining the traditional governance of of our structures, our economic systems, and our way of being. And so that cultural erosion further marginalizes our people. In traditional customs, language, and belief systems were devalued and suppressed in some ways. In many countries, people that continue to practice their traditional customs, their language, their spiritual beliefs were often killed. It's the experience of slaves in America. It is certainly the experience of Native people in Mexico and in other places. And so we have this experience that has been internalized, that if we celebrate and we become proud of who we are, that there is a implicit and overt danger in being able to be out and be proud and be who we are. And so that impact of oppression, including historical trauma from events like slavery and colonization, we know now is passed on from generation to generation, affecting our physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being. That is one of the reasons why we have more chronic illness. That is one of the reasons why we're disproportionately represented in mental illness. That is the reason why, jails are filled with brown and Black people. And so the result is the economic disparity and systemic inequality that we see in education and employment and healthcare. Next slide. So then, why are we so disconnected now? Why are we so disconnected? Knowing all of this information, why are we not able to remain connected, remain empowered, and remain in our spirit and our strength? And so it's important to recognize, and Dr. Williams alluded to this already, that we've experienced a lot of traumatic events, and not only with COVID, but then the second punch of the LA fires, and now like massive deportations that are happening in ICE. You don't have to be undocumented to be affected by this, because we're all empathically connected. And if we teach our children to say, well, that doesn't bother, it shouldn't bother you because you're a US citizen and that doesn't have anything to do with you, then we other the experience, we other that. And yet, our people are living in fear. And it's not just Latino folks, it's everybody, because collectively we have the experience of that trauma. When you see people marching through, through MacArthur Park on horseback, masked, clearing out entire population, it is a scene that stirs up a lot of our collective trauma and our experience of attack and marginalization. And so minorities tend to avoid talking about emotional difficulties and personal challenges, in part because we don't feel that we're going to be understood. We want to avoid being judged or considered weak if we express emotion. And so all of that results in an increased sense of isolation and disconnection. We internalize all of this pain. We struggle with it. And because we've been taught to overcome, because we've been taught to be strong, because we've been taught that we can tolerate all of this, then we don't want to disappoint. And we suffer in silence and avoid, whether it's mental health attention or medical attention or whatever the attention is, we avoid it because we know we're sick. And when we go into that place and somebody's going to diagnose us and say, you are sicker than you thought you were, which is often the case, then we fear the very worst. And so it oftentimes for our people is best to just avoid until the situation gets to so severe that you can't avoid it anymore. And then we have real serious health crises, whether mental or physical or spiritual. So this increase of mistrust in our traditional systems, including education, health, law enforcement, financial, and others, is often, which often do not reflect cultural values, equity, and inclusion. It doesn't reflect who we are. And so the multi-generational trauma then produces an increased vulnerability to addiction, violence, isolation, poverty, criminal involvement, mental illness, chronic health conditions. So to cope, we often disconnect from families and communities, again, feeling that we're going to be misunderstood, judged, or excluded. And so that is one of the reasons why so many men are missing from our families. That's one of the reasons why there are so many ancestors and so many elders that are missing from our families, because we've internalized that level of trauma and we've devalued those roles that really have a protective factor in our communities. Next slide, please. So, okay, so then that's the background, but it doesn't mean that we're powerless. And so it's important for us to think about what can we do? Can we go to the next slide, please? What can we do? So significant, I'm sorry, to go to the next one. What can we do as minorities and people of color? It becomes important for us to increase our awareness and sensitivity within our own minority communities regarding the importance of connection and unity, particularly during challenging and uncertain times. And this whole idea of throwing crumbs at people of color, this idea of having people of color fight for resources, that the Latino community is getting more, or the African American community is getting more, or whatever, all of that stuff is simply designed to further divide and marginalize. And so the idea is we must stay unified, we must stay connected, and we must recognize that our strength really lies in the shared experience of who we are as people that have survived oppression for generations. It is important also to engage our elders and our youth in restorative justice conversations, to explore the importance of community-informed and ancestral practices within our communities. We have not only the illness and the problems, we have the solutions. And it's important for us as communities to come together and really have, as Paulo Freire talked about, the grupos de concientización, groups that really raise our consciousness, groups that really raise our understanding of who we are and what we're living through collectively. Because hell, if I'm going through this experience, I guarantee that you're going through something very similar. And when we come together as a people and we understand how these experiences have affected our identity and our collective experience, we become more powerful and we become more effective, not just in experiencing the problem, but really in identifying the solution. So it's important for us to reach out to others in the community who are struggling with isolation, especially our elders. Our elders have been so disrespected. They have been so marginalized. They're dealing with so many chronic illnesses. But I would say that probably the saddest thing that they're dealing with is the disconnection, because their children have grown. Oftentimes they've been left alone, and they're really, they have so much wisdom and they have so much to offer. It is important for us to restore that connection. The same thing with our youth. Our youth are struggling, and they're struggling not just academically, but socially. COVID really has done a number on our children of color, because we already saw that we're dealing with sometimes, having difficulties academically. And so the idea of them being isolated for 3 years without seeing faces and without having connection has really created a major impact in ability to stay connected and stay healthy. So again, connection is protection. It is a protection against mental illness. It's improving physical and mental well-being. It's important for us to advocate for implementation of culturally competent, relevant services in community-defined ancestral practices that really reflect our values, that can teach these values to our children, and that can show children the wisdom and the power that really comes from identifying with our ancestral past and identifying with those traditions. I became a psychologist because my grandmother was a curandera. She was a healer in Mexico, and I wanted to be just like her. And the closest thing that I found to what she was doing as a curandera, as a healer, was the experience of being a psychologist. And yet I think that there's still so much work to do for us to be able to bring the medicine of our people to our communities. And it's important also to increase our personal awareness of internal and emotional environment. How much of our orientation, how much of our teaching has been toxic? And how reflective have we been about the lessons learned? How much self-awareness do we have? And how much do we create a space to really evaluate what it is that we have identified with and how we can heal ourselves from that? And so it is important to avoid isolation and seek help when we need it, but it also is important for us to be able to speak our truth with certainty and conviction. And so remember that when you heal yourself, you also heal others. There is a saying in Spanish that healing yourself produces the effect of healing 5 generations forward and 5 generations back. And so it is important to recognize that we are all parts of systems. And as we heal ourselves, we also have a collective and reverberating impact on our families, on our communities, because we're teaching and showing that there is a path that is much healthier, and it comes from embracing, not rejecting who we are. It comes from celebrating who we are. So next slide. I want to thank you so much for this honor and opportunity. I've left information here so that you know how to get a hold of me. And again, I am so very honored and so very proud of the work that you do. Consider me your biggest fan. And anytime that you need anything, please call on me. I'm always delighted to be of support. Thank you.
Thank you.